Hello chess fans, this is Rick from Chess to Impress with a video on Anand's amazing Checkmate. It happened in the Tal Memorial tournament of 2018 held in Moscow. And it was a rapid and blitz event this time. Anand also won the rapid event. Let's look at the standings. As you can see, Anand won the blitz section a full point ahead of Mamedyarov, Karyakin and Nakamura. Galfand and Grischuk were on 50%. Kramnik and the young Russian Grandmaster Dubov were on -1, and Svitler and Nepomniachtchi had a bad event with only draws and 2 losses each. In the 8th round, played on the 4th of March 2018, Anand was white against the Russian Grandmaster Alexander Grischuk. Here we see the handshake after the game, but let's see what happened before that. The comments from this game are from Anand himself. He analyzed the game in a magazine New in Chess, and that's where I take these comments from. Anand opened e4 and c5 from Grischuk, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, g6, bishop takes, and here Grischuk took with the d-pawn. While in the game against Dubov, Anand against Dubov in the same event, Dubov took with the b-pawn. Both variations are possible. After d takes, Anand played d3, bishop g7, h3, knight f6, knight c3, black castled, bishop e3, b6, queen d2 and e5. And Anand comments here that this was a very popular line around 2002, so about 16 years ago, this was played a lot. Why can you not take that pawn? Why can you not just take on e5? Well, you can, but then black has knight takes e4, and this is attacking that knight, and it all gets very complicated, but the position is about even. Anand did not go for that, he played bishop h6 instead. Queen d6, Anand went with the king to the queen side, a5, g4. Opposite side castling always gives a very exciting game. Both players are going to attack the opponent's king. a4, Grischuk surges ahead. King b1 and bishop e6 from Grischuk. And here Anand writes that he thought that knight e8 was a better move. And he says with a simple plan of knight c7 to e6, or if white takes on g7, the knight takes back and comes to e6 that way. He said he thought it was a really nice square for the knight on e6 and did not feel that the bishop belonged on e6. Okay, those were Anand's views. But Grischuk thought bishop e6 was a good move. Knight e2, b5 from Grischuk, knight g3, rook fd8. Anand decided to swap that bishop. King takes, queen g5 brings the queen close to black's king, knight d7 and knight f5 check. And that knight has to be taken because it's a fork, but let's first see what Anand writes about this move. He calls this a fairly positional idea. It gets rid of the black bishop, and there are some lines in which black can play b4 and bishop takes a2, check, Anand writes, which is now taken out of the picture, and it's helpful for white to open the g-file against black's king. I felt fairly confident at this stage because I thought I could put a lot of pressure on the black king side, whereas his counterplay on the queen side is much slower. What is nice about Anand's analysis of this game is that he put a lot into words and not so much into variations. It gives us insight in his chess brain, his huge chess brain. I said that knight needs to be taken because it's forking king and queen. Bishop takes f5, g takes f5 and a3 from Grischuk. Anand plays b3, he wants to keep the lines closed against his king, also very instructive. And here Grischuk plays h6, kicking the white queen. Anand writes, Grischuk prefers to keep his king on h7 and bring the rook to g8. which is quite a reasonable defensive plan. He could also have considered rook g8 perhaps, and then followed by queen f6, and even king f8 e7 might have been a good defensive plan. So Anand gives different defensive setups for Grischuk. But Grischuk went for h6. The queen dropped back to g3 and king h7. And now Anand wants to play a rook to g1, but he was thinking which rook. He played rook hg1 and said, the eternal question of which rook. The advantage of the other rook, rook d to g1, is that I have a rook ready on the h file when I go h4 and knight g5. Then at h file, that rook on the h file will be rightly positioned. The disadvantage is that the rook no longer attacks the queen, so black can play c4 more effectively. This rook is now gone from d1, it's no more in a vis-a-vis with the queen, and then a move like c4 will be more effective. So in the end, Anand decided on rook h to g1. Queen f6 from Grischuk and h4. Anand writes, at this point I had about 5 minutes left. I felt my position was quite promising, so I tried to look for a good move. Finally I came up with the idea of lifting the rook to g5 and f5, which seemed to be dangerous. This maneuver, as we'll see. G takes f5 was played by Grischuk, queen h3, f4, and there comes that move rook g5 as Anand had planned when he played h4. But he said it's a real mistake because after this black is better. If I had played king c1, it would not have been easy to see how black can improve his position. So this move instead. He cannot take over the g file because rook d8 is defending the knight on d7. So rook g8 is not possible because then this knight is hanging. And if queen e6, Anand says, we can exchange the queens and white has enough compensation for the pawn because of black's pawn weaknesses. So queen takes, f takes, and white has compensation for the pawn. So king c1 was the best move according to Anand, but he played rook g5, which was a mistake. You cannot take that rook, that's obvious to point out, because then h takes g5 check, and it is check and attacking the queen, so white will win black's queen. Grischuk did not take, he played queen e6 and rook f5, and Anand writes, this was my point because I felt the rook was very uncomfortable for black and that some combination of rook h1, knight g5 check and queen g4 would work. So rook h1, knight g5 check and queen g4, that's the plan, or that's the move that Anand saw. But he says, it seems that I misjudged the position. In this position, Grischuk blundered. He played rook g8. And Anand writes, Grischuk played this fairly confidently. The problem is that it is the move that the hand almost wants you to make, which I had noticed as well, because it was the move that kept popping up. So in Anand's head, in his analysis, in his calculations, that rook g8 seemed a very natural move. But once you see the right idea for white, you eventually work out by elimination that f6 or king h8, both of which Grischuk suggested straight after the game, is better. f6 or king h8 instead of the rook g8 move. It looks like white has some compensation, but the engine defends black's position easily. Well, let's see why rook g8 is such a bad move. Anand played knight g5 check. And because it's forking king and queen again, we have to take that piece. Grischuk took it. And now Anand dropped the bomb into black's position. Rook takes f7 check. And from the live footage it was clear that Grischuk got a fright. He had not seen this move. Anand writes, it was only here that it hit him what had happened. It took him some time to absorb it, but then he very sportingly decided to let the spectators see the mate. So let's see the mate. You really have to take the rook, because the move rook takes f7 is a discovered attack from white's queen on black's queen, so you have to take on f7, but that queen is in a very unfortunate position there. It's not controlling the h6 square anymore. Anand played h takes g5 check, king g7, and there's the checkmate. Queen h6, checkmate. What a beautiful combination at the end. From the great Vishwanathan Anand. And as Jan Timman, Grandmaster Jan Timman, writes in that same edition of New in Chess, it inspired the German study composer Martin Minsky, because he published this study in the Chess Star publication. And he dedicated it to Anand. It's white to play and win here, and it's the same combination as we saw from Anand. If we look at the position, we see that white is a piece up, but black does have enough counterplay against white's vulnerable king. This position is in a balance. If not, for the only move that wins here, and that's knight e5. Hitting the rook, you cannot drop back to g7, because then there is rook f8 check, and we see that discovered attack on the queen, as we saw on the Anand Grischuk game. So rook g8 is the only move after knight e5, but there comes the combination knight f7 check, king h7, and knight g5 check. Forking king and queen, so you have to take the knight, h takes, and there comes Anand's move, rook f7 check, to win the game. Again, there's the discovered attack on the queen, so you have to take the rook, h takes g5, check, king g7, and checkmate. Study composers call this mate with two self-blocks. The black queen and rook are occupying the squares, which were the flight squares of black's king against a checkmate. As Timman writes, mate with two self-blocks means that the black rook and queen have been lured to squares that the king will no longer be able to access. And self-block is the motif in this study, inspired by that beautiful game that Vishwanathan Anand played against Alexander Grischuk in the 2018 Tal Memorial. One more time the picture of the handshake. Very sportingly that Grischuk let this position be played out till mate. We see the queen on h6, the king on g7, and the black queen and rook blockading the escape squares for the black king. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give the video a thumbs up and please subscribe to the Chess to Impress channel. Please leave a comment, I will read them all and I will reply. You also may want to check out my Chess to Progress channel. The link is in the description box. This is Rick for Chess to Impress. Thank you for watching.